Remembering the life and legacy of Winnie Mandela. For decades, she was a prominent figure in the fight against apartheid. As South Africans say goodbye to the woman they call the mother of the nation, we ask, who are the next generation of leaders? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Outspoken, defiant, controversial. Many called her the mother of the nation. Winnie Mandela was one of the most prominent leaders of the decades-long fight against white minority rule in South Africa. When her husband, the late Nelson Mandela, was in prison for 27 years, she became the face of the movement to bring equality and justice. But years later, that image suffered when Winnie was convicted of involvement in the beating death of a suspected police informant, a case that was brought before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the end of apartheid. While throughout her life, Winnie Mandela inspired and fought for millions of poor South Africans. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, Catherine Soy reports from Soweto.
A vigil for Winnie Mandela in Soweto, the very heart of the anti-apartheid struggle. President Cyril Ramaphosa came to pay his respects.
As we say in African culture, a gigantic tree has fallen. And this is the Winnie Mandela tree that provided shade for the people of South Africa.
Mandela will be given a state funeral next Saturday, and before that there'll be memorial services and vigils across the country.
She has been one of the strongest women in our struggle, who suffered immensely under the apartheid regime, who was imprisoned, who was banished, who was treated very badly, separated not only from her husband, but from her children as well and her people. But notwithstanding all this, she remained strong, she remained determined, she was courageous.
Apartheid is a criminal act.
She became the face and voice of Nelson Mandela and the anti-apartheid campaign while he was in prison for 27 years.
All these people say they're here to celebrate the life of Winnie Mandela, but she was also a very controversial figure. She's been accused of being involved in human rights abuses during the apartheid times. She's also been accused of having a very militant leadership style. Some say this could taint her legacy.
But for people here, the evil of the apartheid system she fought dwarfed her shortcomings.
You would understand that the apartheid oppression itself was violent. So it was natural on her part to propagate violence against apartheid oppression.
The thing that comes to mind is that she defied an apartheid system which has had such a huge negative impact on our country, and the legacy of apartheid still lives on today.
She might have lived a checkered life with her own political and personal struggles, but many people in South Africa want to remember her for the role she played in the fight against apartheid and the impact she had on millions of people here. For them, she is the mother of the nation. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, joining me from Johannesburg is Tokyo Sexwale. He's South Africa's former Minister for Human Settlement until 2013. He's also a former prisoner alongside Nelson Mandela. Thanks very much for speaking to me on Al Jazeera. You're obviously outside the home of Winnie Mandela, where people have come to pay their respects. Mr. Sexwale, how would you describe the icon that South Africa has lost?
I must say that it's a sad day here in South Africa, with the loss of somebody we consider as one of our most iconic leaders. He's a pioneer amongst women, the first black social worker in South Africa, and of course was a companion of Nelson Mandela. Winnie Mandela was like a candle in the crosswinds of contradictions in our country. She served the people with fortitude and survived all the brutal years under apartheid, being imprisoned, being detained, being tortured sometimes, but lived to see on her husband coming from jail after 27 years. Still went on with the struggle for social change. She was often described as the mother of the nation, but strictly speaking, she's the mother of the unwashed poor, of the poorest in our country. That's who she is. We have lost a great iconic leader here.
And I understand that you were able to speak to her last week. Can you tell us anything about that conversation, anything that she said to you that stands out for you?
Well, my family foundation provides wheelchairs, and I wanted to give her a wheelchair because she's using a stick right now. But the defiant and indefatigable Winnie was even defying gravity, was refusing to find herself walking or being assisted with the wheelchair. But the conversation was about social change in South Africa, the incomplete revolution. She was talking about the fact that the land is still not yet with the people, the economy is still not yet with the masses, and of course the wherewithal, social change, economic change still needs to continue in South Africa despite the fact that we have political freedom. So she was insistent on that, but also very forgiving, to say the people who tortured her, the people who did all types of things, will always be in her prayers. It was almost a repetition of what she had said in an interview in 2013. So Winnie had reached a level where she was calm with herself. I think she understood that she's on her last legs, that she'll be going, and gave an interview of that special nature where she was saying to South Africans, there is a need to understand that the struggle for social justice, for economic justice, continues despite the fact that we have got political power.
So do you believe that she believed her job was done when she died? What do you think her legacy is going to be?
Well, the legacy of Winnie Mandela is the fact that she was a pioneer amongst women. But let's also get it right. Winnie was not just a chip of the block of Nelson Mandela. She carved her own stature, her own authority on her own. 27 years without her husband, 27 years as a single parent, and 27 years as the only shining light inside South Africa at the time when her organization, the African National Congress, was banned, at the time when the leaders like Nelson Mandela were in prison. She virtually was the soul. When I say soul, she was working alone because she was isolated and banned. She was the light that kept our people alive. Her legacy is the legacy of struggle, indefatigable, defiant to the last moment. That is Winnie. But in the struggle of women, she put us very, very high. Right now, South Africa occupies one of the top positions in the world with representation of women in all the national bodies, the government, the judiciary, as well as in parliament. She left the legacy of a fighter for social change, so that we should care about ordinary people who are not in the center stage of the economy, the poorest of the poor, the unwashed. That's a legacy, and it's a legacy that still needs to be worked upon by those of us who are remaining to make sure that our people realize the true worth of the freedom that Mandela has struggled for.
But she also was a woman that was mired in certain controversies. She was convicted in the 1991 kidnapping and killing of a suspected 14-year-old spy, Stompie Saipe. She was also convicted of fraud and theft. To what extent did her controversies overshadow her image as a woman who fights for liberation?
The struggle for liberation, like any struggle, does have its undersides. Winnie is not to be whitewashed. Winnie made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. Winnie was implicated in the death of this young man during the course of the struggle. You know how apartheid used to work? They would finger anyone as a spy, and this young man was fingered, and Winnie found herself caught up in that situation. But what we had said is that there's one thing that we can never get wrong with Winnie Mandela. All the mistakes that she has made were in the direction of our struggle, in the direction of our revolution. At no stage did any of those mistakes detract her from the road of change, the road of freedom in South Africa. We're not whitewashing these things. People should talk about her life, talk about her positives as well as the negatives. But we're saying that at no stage did she ever compromise our struggle or betray our people. We accept her fully with the mistakes that she has made. And she has been told by ourselves where things were wrong. And they went horribly wrong. That's what Archbishop Desmond Tutu said at what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. He asked her, surely things did go horribly wrong, Winnie? And she hesitated, but in the end she said yes. She accepted, and hers was to atone. But at this moment, here in this country, on this continent, we are not looking when a person is dead, we don't try to mire and cut her down insofar as what shortcomings she has got. That will address in history. At this moment, we are mourning for Winnie. We have taken the positives from her book of life. We are not aware of her shortcomings, but we want to emphasize her legacy, the good things that she did for our struggle, for the emancipation of all our people, mistakes and all. They do happen, these type of things, and we've never condoned them.
Okay, and just finally, can you just tell us what is more of the situation behind you? I know you're outside of her home in Soweto. Just set the scene for us, if you may, and perhaps tell us some of the stories that people are saying about Winnie Mandela.
Well, there's a lot of media here, including the good old Al Jazeera. Many people from across the country are here. And it's common cause that when somebody has passed away of this stature, people come at home to pass condolences and so on. You know, when you saw when Princess Diana passed on, people come outside the palace to put flowers and so on. In our country, people toy. They come to sing. Toying is a dance. All this ululating that we're hearing behind me, they do that. They're here to reminisce. They're here to exchange, to hold one another. People can't sit in their own homes and weep and mourn for Winnie. This is a mourning. They come here to mourn, to hold one another. And that's what is happening here.
All right, Mr. Tokyo Sexwale, we thank you very much for speaking to us from Johannesburg. Now I'm joined by Thembisa Fakude. He's a researcher at the Al Jazeera Center for Studies and former chairman of the Foreign Correspondents Association of South Africa. And from Johannesburg, Aisha Kaji, an activist and writer who specializes in governance and development. Welcome to you both. Thanks for speaking to us on Inside Story. This is what the president has said. Cyril Ramaphosa saying she was a voice for the voiceless, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation put out a statement. Winnie never elevated herself above the people. How much does that ring true for you?
Well, that's very true. She was the face of the South African struggle for much more longer than many of the current leaders within the ANC. When many of the African National Congress leaders were in exile and some of them were in prison, the person who led the struggle in South Africa was Winnie Mandela, amongst others. So yes, she represented the struggle for a very long time. In fact, for many of my generation, the only face we knew which represented the apartheid struggle was that of Winnie Mandela, because we were not allowed, for example, to have pictures of other liberation movement leaders circulated within a certain community. So Winnie Mandela became the face of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. So yes, I totally agree with what the president has said yesterday.
Aisha, she was referred to as the mother of the nation. What was it for you that made her earn that title?
Well, the very first time I saw her from a distance in the township of Umlazi in KwaZulu-Natal, she made a promise to a community that didn't have running water, that they would within a month or two get what used to be called standpipes. In other words, pipes outside every few houses. So not within the houses, but outside every few houses, so they wouldn't have to, transport water. And within a few weeks, less than a month literally, that happened. I saw that in action under apartheid. That was an extremely powerful statement for me as to who Winnie was, what she was, how she operated. She came across as regal, as compassionate and passionate, and very, very idealistic, fiery, but an orator's dream.
Thembisa, she herself had to endure quite a bit while Nelson Mandela was in prison himself. How much did she have to endure and put up with then?
Well, she was banished to some obscure village in the then Free State, southern part of South Africa, taken away from her common environment. She was deprived of living a normal life because of her association first with Nelson Mandela, but of course later on, because of her involvement within the struggle of South Africa, she was jailed, often in solitary confinement in many other instances, deprived of playing a role of a mother to her 2 kids at the time. So yeah, I mean, Winnie Mandela went through quite a bit, but also as a woman, she epitomizes that, you know, African woman spirit, the enduring one. And no wonder many people, particularly the youngsters around where she lived, were attracted to her house. And because of that, she started some social kind of gatherings, including the football club, which later on came to kind of haunt her political life. But she was a mother figure to many people and youngsters in South Africa. So yes, she will be dearly missed by many. And it's difficult at this particular time to find anything negative to say about her, notwithstanding, of course, that there's been a lot that has been reported over the years of what she did and what I mean, those are people who have the benefit of hindsight. It's quite easy for them to comment negatively about her role in the political struggle of South Africa. But for those who were around her vicinity and who lived particularly in Soweto, they will tell you that she was a pillar of strength, and that's why she was attractive, including her house, much more attractive to the youngsters from around the township at the time.
Well, in the spirit of looking at her life in a whole, we will have to look at some of the controversies in just a moment. Before I get into that, Aisha, she once said this, I am not Mandela's product. I am the product of the masses of my country and the product of my enemy. What must it have been like for her being a female leader, a woman, in that time, in that movement and that culture?
Yeah, as Thembisa has said, you know, she was very isolated. She wrote a book called 491 about her 491 days of confinement in incarceration. And for the first 290 odd days of that, she didn't have access to anyone except her interrogators and jailers. Imagine how that must have felt as a young mother who'd been taken from her home in the middle of the night, not knowing where her children were, not knowing whether they were being cared for, no access to anybody outside those jailers for almost a year. And here she was, the person who was bearing the burden of carrying on Mandela's iconography, if you will, in a personal sense, after he'd been sentenced to life imprisonment, after the ANC and other liberation movements had been banned. In many ways, she was a black power movement's, a black feminist movement's dream. She was at a time when the apartheid government was trying to convince not just white people, but black people too, that blackness was equivalent to ugliness, that blackness was equivalent to stupidity. Here was an outstandingly beautiful woman with an extraordinary intellect, with a power of oratory, with a huge personal charisma. She was the apartheid state's worst nightmare incarnate. And in all of that, and through all the struggles and travails she underwent, she was fearless. She had so much courage. She was indomitable. She remained compassionate and passionate, and very much a people's person.
Thembisa, with the controversies,
but at the same time,
however,
I must say,
just 1 second, if you may, Aisha. Thembisa, with her controversies, how much influence was she still able to exert?
Well, she exerted a tremendous amount of influence. As I've said earlier on, that for those who have the benefit of hindsight, yes, they can criticize her. But for her, she was, you know, on the ground, leading from the front. And she influenced a lot, not only in terms of the political struggle in South Africa, but also the gender justice movement or feminism, for example, the understanding of feminisms. She will say at some places that, for example, women of the Global South have got different social-political agencies compared to the women of the Global North. She was one of the people that, at least for me personally, assisted me in understanding the differences. So she was extremely, extremely influential. She was also a social worker. If you go to her current house in Soweto and speak to the neighbors, they will tell you that she was involved in all kind of social projects within the vicinity. But most importantly, I used to meet her in a shopping complex called Macro in Johannesburg. She did her own shopping often, and she would be posing with the shoppers for pictures, etc. So she was an all-rounder. She was a mother, she was a freedom fighter, but most importantly, she was that normal good neighbor. And I think many people will remember her in different ways.
Okay, Aisha, the South African Communist Party has put out this statement saying that it's deeply worried that the South African Revolution is losing the veterans who contributed immensely to our struggle against colonial oppression, and South Africa is now poorer without her. Do you agree?
I agree that South Africa is now poorer without many of our veterans, but I think we must also avoid a tendency towards hagiography. Winnie was not perfect. She was flawed. I was a teenager when the whole scandal about Stompie broke, about Abubakar Asvat's death broke, and her alleged involvement in that, about her spear campaign against a priest based largely on homophobia, etc. So there were negatives in her life. Many will pass these off as being products of post-traumatic stress disorder, as being part of a war situation. But even within a war situation, there is a principle of jus bello, of just war. And Winnie, certainly from the evidence we have in books such as Khadiza's Journey, which really highlights how a witness for the TRC during her hearing was spirited out of the country, tortured and incarcerated in Zambia for a while, and eventually made his way to the UK. Certainly that eyewitness testimony of somebody who witnessed Stompie's murder and her involvement in it, he was another member of this football club. It really, really speaks to the fact that there was very little done to establish whether the allegations against Stompie were actually true or not. And there's a lot in that narrative that shows her up as somebody who was deeply flawed, who was very judgmental at times, very contradictory at other times, almost perverse, almost multiple personas.
And here's the thing, Aisha, for the sake of time, let me just jump in there, because Thembisa, she was very critical, some people would say, of the ANC, for example. So how would you describe the state of the relationship between Winnie Mandela and the ANC today? How do you think the ANC is seeing this? And what do you think she would think of the state of the party today? Well,
I think the challenge is that Winnie Mandela led the struggle, or led the ANC in the absence of the leaders of the ANC for a very long time. And sadly, when many of the ANC political prisoners were released and some who were in exile returned to South Africa, mainly men, to an extent imposed on her. And she was already a powerhouse. She had established herself in her own right as a strong political leader. And I think to an extent that's where the conflict of ideas and the conflict of how to move the organization forward started creeping in. And she was, of course, very critical of certain members of the ANC and certain leaders of the ANC, because the ANC, after at least 1994, when the first democratic elections occurred in South Africa, many of them fell into the trap of the comforts of power. And she was one of those who criticized the ANC.
She criticized the president himself at the time.
Yes, she criticized all presidents,
right.
Including her own former husband, right. Nelson Mandela. So she was very critical because she stood for a position. And that's what she'll be missed for. She was not, she did not follow the ANC's instruction to the latter, even though, some of those instructions that were given to her, when she felt that they were not correct, she spoke against them, and she spoke against the leadership of the ANC, and she'll be remembered for that by many people, including some of the ANC leaders.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Thembisa Fakude, for joining us. And Aisha Kaji, thank you for speaking to us as well. And earlier we had Tokyo Sexwale, who was talking to us on the program. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.